Hi, I'm Katrina Vulder. Welcome to the Practical Ethics channel, where I regularly post video interviews with academics on all sorts of topics related to practical ethics. So if you'd like to see more of these videos, please don't forget to subscribe. According to recent newspaper reports, the UK wants to increase the use of chemical castration in sex offenders in order to reduce their risk of reoffending. Dr. Tom Douglas, a philosopher here at Oxford, leads a research project on the ethics of using neurointerventions to prevent crime. So I asked him what he thinks about increasing the use of chemical castration in sex offenders.
I think it's a good idea to at least put this option on the table. There are legitimate concerns about safety and effectiveness of chemical castration, but it's at least not obvious in advance that chemical castration is any less safe or less effective than other means that we're currently using to try to prevent reoffending in sex offenders. So one thing that is currently used widely, including in the UK, is simply locking up sex offenders for very long periods of time to try to separate them from their potential victims. But this is very unsafe in the sense that it has a lot of negative side effects on the offenders' relationships and careers and lives in general. And it's also, at least after the point of release, not at all effective at preventing reoffending. You might think that chemical castration is very likely to be safer and more effective than very long periods of imprisonment.
Will sex offenders actually have the choice to undergo chemical castration, or will it be compulsory?
So there are different ways in which it could be done, and in which it is done in other countries that use chemical castration more than the UK. On one model, the chemical castration is imposed as a part of the initial sentence. So an offender might be sentenced to, say, 5 years imprisonment, followed by, say, 3 years of receiving regular injections of the agent involved in chemical castration. But a different model, and one that I think is closer to the right approach, is to wait until an offender has served the minimum prison term and has come up for parole or early release. And at that point, if the individual is deemed too risky to release into society, you could potentially offer the individual the choice between some form of further detention, like preventive detention, and agreeing to undergo a treatment program that would reduce their risk, and that might include something like chemical castration as well as perhaps psychological therapies.
So, but if the only alternative to the sex offender is to remain in prison, aren't we actually coercing sex offenders into undergoing chemical castration?
Some people think so. I think it's not so clear that this is coercive, or at least not coercive in a morally unjustified way. In typical cases of unjustified coercion, the coercer is threatening to act wrongly or impermissibly if the person they're coercing doesn't go along with the threat. So suppose someone holds a gun to your head and says your money or your life. And if you don't hand over the money, they're going to kill you. And that would be impermissible or wrong. But in the case we're thinking about, the state is effectively saying to an offender, if you don't agree to chemical castration, we're going to subject you to some form of preventive detention. And since it's not clear that preventive detention is unjustified, it's not clear that the state is really threatening to act wrongly or impermissibly in this kind of case. But more importantly, even if it is coercive to offer this choice between preventive detention and chemical castration, it doesn't obviously follow that it's ethically unjustified. After all, there are all sorts of things that we currently do in the context of criminal justice that are coercive. Preventive detention itself is an example.
But usually we don't accept coercive treatments in a medical context. For example, we think that it's usually wrong to force people to undergo some sort of medical treatment. So where lies the difference?
Well, one difference here is that in a typical medical context, we're thinking about what would be in the best interests of an individual patient, whereas here we're talking about a criminal justice context where perhaps we think that at least one of the legitimate purposes of the state is to protect the public and think about the interests of third parties, of people who might be harmed by reoffending. Some people still will say, though, that even if we're talking about a criminal justice context, we shouldn't be, and even if we accept coercion in a criminal justice context, we shouldn't accept coercive uses of medical interventions in particular. Some people would draw a distinction, for example, between something like preventive detention, which constrains someone's freedom of movement but doesn't physically invade a person's body, and something like chemical castration, which involves bodily interference, involves injecting a drug into someone's body and therefore is sort of internally physically intrusive in a way that preventive detention is not. I think it's not so clear that there's an important moral difference here. And I would also note that there are some areas in which we do think that physically invasive medical interventions can justifiably be imposed on a person coercively. So think about the context of infectious disease control. Imagine that a pandemic disease is spreading through a population. In that kind of context, we might think that it would be justified to require individuals to undergo treatments or vaccinations that would make them less infectious to others, even if this requires receiving injections of a drug and is therefore physically invasive. Another objection that some would raise to the coercive use of chemical castration is that it involves a kind of mental or psychological interference. So the problem is not that it involves injecting a drug into someone's body, but that it involves trying to change that person's desires or preferences. I think this is the strongest objection to the coercive use of chemical castration, but I'm not completely convinced that it's decisive. So suppose that we had some other way of changing or diminishing the sex drive of sex offenders. Suppose, for example, that we could paint the walls of a prison in a soothing shade of green that would somehow suppress the strongest sexual urges of some sex offenders, and that could decrease rates of sexual offending within prisons. Would we think it was okay to paint the walls of a prison in that soothing shade of green? It seems to me that we would think that was acceptable, and it's not so clear to me why we should think that chemical castration is necessarily any more problematic than that sort of intervention with respect to its degree of psychological or mental invasiveness or interference.
Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to subscribe to the Practical Ethics channel.